able to attend today. So if you don't want your face recorded, not that most of the faces shouldn't be appearing, but just if you want to stay out of that sort of thing, you can just keep your video off, your sound off. No one will know you're here. And just to limit feedback, sound feedback, all attendees are currently muted. However, if there is some reason you need to speak up, please do so. Also, there's a chat box. Hopefully people are familiar with that at this point, having done other webinars and Zoom meetings. But there you can put your questions and we'll have time at the end to answer them. And so, but you want to make sure that you switch your the field in the chat box to all panelists and attendees or everyone, just to make sure that everyone can see your questions, not just the panelist. And then if you wouldn't mind taking a moment right now, if you can see where that chat box is, just writing in your name and where you're coming from, like what town you're in from or what organization you're affiliated with, just so that we have kind of a list of who's here. And that also can help Wyatt kind of understand if it's mostly landowners here who are looking for answers, or if it's a lot of organization, conservation agencies, and just like, yeah, what brought you here today? But welcome. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and just give an brief introduction of Wyatt, and then we'll get started. So one moment.
Tessa, would you like me to just start sharing my screen now?
Yeah, if you want to bring it up, and I'm just gonna introduce you.
Cool.
All right, while Wyatt's switching to his screen, I just want to say, once again, welcome, and the backgrounds. I met Wyatt when we were both undergraduates in at Bard College in the biology department. Bard College is in New York, near the Catskills. Wyatt's Bard senior project focused on the genetics of Chinese praying mantises, and the study of insects continues as Wyatt researches the genetics and evolution of social behavior in carpenter bees. As a PhD candidate and National Science Foundation Fellow in the biology department at the University of New Hampshire. He has told me he is drawn to the connection between ecology and animal behavior and is fascinated by the insights into ecosystem health that pollinators provide. So today he'll be giving us an overview on native bee species, why some species are declining, and what we can do to help. So from there, take it away, Wyatt.
Thanks so much, Tessa. And thank you, Hilltown Land Trust, for hosting me. Really appreciate it. I'm a Pioneer Valley native, and although my research has focused on the evolution of sociality in bees, I'm also passionate about native bee species conservation and proactive engagement with the natural community. What can we all do to engage with that community? So the title of this webinar is Diversity, Decline, and Conservation of Native Bees. That's pretty much exactly what I'll be talking about today. This first slide features the largest and smallest native bees in the US, Xylocopa varipuncta, which is that humongous face you're looking at now, and Perdita minima, which is just clinging onto an antenna. Kind of cool. So anyway, I'll be delivering this webinar in 3 chunks. First, I'll introduce us to a few of our native bee groups and their life histories. I'll then describe the sort of unfortunate status of native bee populations and the many factors that affect their collective health. And then we can go right into some sustainable solutions, things that each of us can do at home or in our community to lend a hand in supporting our native bees. So what is a native bee? And honestly, even before that, what is a bee? Here's just a really abbreviated evolutionary family tree of wasps, ants, and bees. These are all members of a group that we call Hymenoptera. Bees diverged from wasps about 180 million years ago, if you can believe it, and from ants about 160 million years ago. So in this way, we can sort of think of bees as essentially vegetarian wasps. However, when we think of native bees specifically, unfortunately, we're most definitely not talking about the honeybee, the bee that we're probably all familiar with. I think for most folks, honeybees are the sort of archetypical bee, orange and black, living in a huge hive in which they produce honey, of course. Honeybees do pollinate many different plants and are effectively domesticated And it's for these reasons that they were actually introduced to North America by European colonists as early as the early 1600s, which makes them a non-native species. It turns out the incredible social complexity of honeybees with their queen and thousands of workers is actually very rare among bees. And this gets into a realm that I've been exploring with my PhD research. Why have only some lineages of bees evolved to be so highly social? I can talk more about this later if anyone's interested, but for now, when I say native bees, I'm referring to any one of the over 4,000 species of bees that we have in North America alone, of which well over 300 exist in New England. That is a huge number and is actually only a fifth of the well over 20,000 species we have worldwide, which is pretty incredible. And first off, I just want to walk us through a few of the major species groups that we can expect to see in our yards. A lot of these groups don't look anything like honeybees and have very different life histories. And I think familiarity and understanding are basically important foundations for compassion. I'm sure everyone tuning in today already really cares about the bees, but I think it's just fun to get familiar with a few of these funkier groups. So also a critical disclaimer for anyone a little understandably concerned out there: native bees will not sting you, so never fear. It is only the highly social bees and mainly the wasps that will sting, and it's only the venom that causes the sting to hurt so very badly. Otherwise, you're just getting like a little pinprick. So with that, let's check out a few. So here we have a sweat bee in the family Halictidae. What you see on your screen is a species of Agochlorella, a metallic sweat bee. Notice how iridescent this bee appears, kind of a far cry from the sort of yellow and black we might be familiar with. There are many kinds of sweat bee in New England and across North America, including those like this one in the genus Agochloropsis. As with many of our native bees, most sweat bees are solitary ground nesters. This means that if drawn to your yard, a female will dig a small tunnel into some soft earth to establish her burrow. And it's inside of this burrow that she will lay a small clutch of eggs, maybe 3 or 4, with some pollen provisions. And that's pretty much that. These bees have no workers. They don't really produce honey. They'll sometimes nest near each other in a little aggregation. And this is effectively a strategy that we would maybe consider like a neighborhood watch. So they're able to help each other fend off predators and parasites. But it does not keep them safe from rototillers. Here's a summary example of what things look like underground. On the left, you can see the entrance passageway and various brood cells. And on the right, we have a close-up of a ball of pollen onto which a single egg has been laid. This subterranean kind of strategy seems very different than the honeycomb nest that we might associate with a typical honeybee hive, but it's actually employed by most of our native bee species. It might also help explain why we may rarely know that wild bees are actually living in our yard, since these holes can be pretty easily overlooked. Here we have an example of a leafcutter bee from the family Megachilidae. Leafcutters are generally medium-sized for bees. Many are around the size of a typical honeybee. Much like the sweat bees, though, these guys are almost entirely solitary, meaning they do not form hives. This is a Megachile texana. We don't have them around here in New England, but this image nicely illustrates how leafcutters carry pollen. You're probably familiar with honeybees or bumblebees carrying pollen around on their legs in the sort of pollen baskets. Leafcutters instead carry pollen on their abdomens. So those white hairs that you see sticking off of the abdomen there are called scopa, and they are there specifically to facilitate pollen collection while these guys are basically swimming around on the tops of flowers. It's kind of hilarious to watch. Very cute. As you may have guessed from their name, leafcutter bees trim bits of foliage to line their nests and form cells for their brood. They typically nest in cavities in wood or rock, but may also take to the ground, as we saw with the sweat bees. Here's just a quick clip, hopefully this will play, of a leafcutter bee making herself right at home in a balsa wood observation nest that I designed specifically for a different species during my research. Here, one sec, let me get it playing here. Balsa wood, very soft wood, of course, but she's still making extremely short work of it. You'll see her pop out in just a second and fly away. And off she goes. Here we go. And here's an example of what that nest would eventually wind up looking like if we were to take a cross section. So she's used leaves to form brood cells, and then she'll use a sort of vegetative wad to stop her up the burrow and keep her young safe as they develop. Leaf cutters also include mason bees, which obviously don't cut leaves. The family, I should say, Megachilidae, includes these bees. And these are in the group that we refer to as trap nesting bees. So these are just a sort of a grab bag term for species that prefer to use extant cavities for their nests. So Osmia atraventris, which we see here, picture isn't the best resolution, but you get the idea. This is a mason bee, and as the name suggests, once she has established her brood, she'll use mud or rocks to stop her up the entrance and keep her brood safe. And when I say that they will use cavities of all kinds, I really mean it. Mason bees will live inside of snail shells once discarded, and if we take a look inside, we'll see it's actually a pretty cozy home for their young. So on the left here, we have 2 more images of bees crawling out of newly established brood burrows. And on the right, sort of someone has very carefully whittled away the snail shell to reveal this little larva munching away on some pollen. So pretty cool. We also, of course, have carpenter bees. I'm sure some listeners out there are probably already familiar with the large carpenter bees, such as the Xylocopinae virginica, which will occasionally punch some pretty serious holes in your porch or deck. Not a popular species for that reason. They dwarf their close cousins, the, as you probably may have guessed, small carpenter bees, such as this little Ceratina calcarata, which instead make their burrows in the soft pith of woody stems. Incidentally, I primarily study small carpenter bees. They can be found all around the globe, are incredibly diverse, and are generally awesome. So shameless plug for those guys. This is another local small carpenter bee species, Ceratina dupla. Again, as we saw with the sweat bees, very metallic. It's blue of all colors. And contrary to what you may think from your screen, it's actually quite small, basically the size of a very large ant. So again, may not read as a bee if you were to see one of these things on the wing in your yard. As I mentioned, small carpenter bees live inside of woody stems with soft pith, such as sumacs and any of the berry brambles. So these are your raspberries or blackberries. And these also happen to be plants that they love to pollinate. So if you maintain a few stands of raspberries or blackberries in your yard, be sure to trim the canes each year, and you'll be supporting this group while simultaneously securing yourself, a pretty good snack. And you may even help my research. So basically, focus on these guys. Their larger cousins, these are the large carpenter bees, of course, are the ones potentially damaging your property, unfortunately. Their burrows are not always linear. As you can see here on the left, the yellow is all pollen that's been collected with some brood sort of clambering about now that the nest has been exposed. It's not exactly a linear burrow. But again, these guys are powerful pollinators and worth support if you can stand it. And saving perhaps the most familiar for last among our native species, the nearly ubiquitous bumblebees. Bumblebees probably get the most press after honeybees, but they're important to bring up nonetheless. Bumblebees are arguably the most social of our native species. They form colonies with a queen and workers that grow to be about 50 to maybe 400 individuals strong, so still greatly dwarfed by honeybee hives, which can be in the thousands. And it's actually this time of year that you can expect to see bumblebee queens foraging and seeking a suitable burrow to establish their nest, which can be anything from a little crevice in the ground to even like a former mouse burrow. They like established openings. If everything goes well, the nest will look something like this. It's kind of a mess. What you're looking at is a heap of brood pots in which young are reared. And yeah, a pretty awesome species. They buzz pollinate, which means that they will vibrate the flowers that they're feeding on, which is a necessary trigger for pollen release in some plants that we have, such as blueberries in this picture on the right with that bell-shaped flower. Unfortunately, due to climate change and land use practices, the rusty-patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis, which we see in these images, is actually now quite endangered and extirpated from 87% of its historic range. And this is a unfortunate statistic that very much brings on the next portion of this webinar. Now that we've become a little more familiar with just a handful of the awesome diversity of our native bees, each one so powerful, so interesting, and a supporter of our sort of interconnected natural ecosystem, native ecosystem, native bees are very much on the decline. And I know, especially right now, it can feel like there's a new thing to worry about every single day, but the bees really do need whatever help that we can spare. For years now, research has shown horrible declines in pollinator counts at both national and global scales. Studies into honeybees and their colony collapse have been something of a canary in the coal mine for our native species as well. Where work has been done, many native bee population counts have been shown to be in some measure of deterioration for over 100 years. For example, these figures show counts of just a few species over time, from around 1872 through 2011. It's a nice summary of the work overall. Native species such as bumblebees and other groups, which are shown in A and B, are on an alarmingly steady decline. So if you see those trend lines, just moving on down. While non-native bee species, shown in C, have steadily increased. So what is going on? Why are the bees so badly at risk, with populations of many native groups deteriorating over time? There are, unfortunately, many interconnected factors affecting pollinator health. First and foremost, land use practices. So this is application of pesticides and herbicides, urbanization, general use and abuse of our yards and wild spaces. This sets a hard ceiling on the ability of our local ecosystems to maintain their health. This is particularly true in the face of a very rapidly changing climate. This is, of course, a huge problem for a number of reasons, but the one I want to highlight today is that a changing climate quickly throws off the phenology, which is the typical seasonal timing or rhythm of plants and animals. I'll give you just a quick example of what I mean. This is a very busy figure, but bear with me, I will break it down. On the left in red, we have the blooming periods of various plant species over the course of a year, and on the right, the foraging and breeding activity of various bees. In other words, these are plant and bee phenologies, when we would expect to start to see these species groups become active, increasing densities of activity. So when do we see them most? And then they fade out as the season comes to a close. The tons of diagonal lines down the middle of the figure captures just how interconnected all of these species are with one another. So they indicate single paired relationships, but obviously there's many. It's no accident that if we look at a given time of year, we can see that the majority of either group is active in synchrony with the other. Unfortunately, our rapidly shifting climate can mean that late winter is actually more like early spring. For example, if it's a little too warm and wet in February and March, some species may get things going too soon and either hatch or bloom before support is actually there. So a bee may come out of its burrow to no flowers, or a flower may bloom, and there just aren't pollinators around to help it complete its cycle. So the effects of climate change are really rough, and they can be further exacerbated by introduced species. So this is the alien species icon that has now appeared in the bottom right of our former figure. These are plants, bees, or other animals that are introduced to an ecosystem and can disrupt plant pollinator mutualisms through competition for fundamentally limited resources. So in this hypothetical example, a large colony of honeybees is introduced to an ecosystem in which there are established native plant pollinator mutualisms shown here currently. So honeybees come in. As they are generalists, they'll pollinate almost anything available, but they have such a large colony size that they may outcompete the native species in that area. Further, as generalists, they are likely to also pollinate aggressively invasive plants, such as multiflora rose, potentially contributing to the extirpation of other native plant species. So before you know it, the native plants and pollinators have been replaced. All these factors exacerbate the perennial damages of parasites and disease, just as we can transmit viruses and other pathogens to each other in public spaces. Bees are kind of continuously transmitting diseases to one another off the surface of flowers or in their hives. So yeah, it can feel pretty overwhelming to take all this in, but I'd rather look at these four major contributors to population decline as a kind of playbook for the very tangible avenues of action that we can all engage in to support native bees, which takes us at long last to some sustainable solutions to native bee population recovery and conservation. An often repeated statement, every third mouthful of food we eat is dependent on the unmanaged pollination service of bees. Farmers once relied much more heavily on native bees for crop pollination, but these ongoing population downfalls have increasingly necessitated the use of managed honeybee pollination services, which is awesome that we can utilize those species. But I think with the right approach, we can all help to support our native bees and keep them a functioning and important part of our ecosystems and agriculture. So let's look back at our four major drivers of population decline: land misuse, climate change, alien species, and transmission of disease, and use these to define a playbook for native bee recovery. When it comes to addressing land use in general, especially in the backyard, research based out of our very own UMass Amherst has shown that by simply mowing less, letting lawns grow in for around 2 weeks at a time, you can improve backyard bee diversity. Along similar lines, reducing or eliminating pesticide and herbicide use, which may seem obvious, really does help to improve the health of your yard. So, one case here, if you can stand it, consider letting your yards get a little more scruffy and weedy before you come in to mow them. When it comes to responding to the effects of climate change in the backyard, my advice is to improve your yard's resilience by planting a greater variety of native flowers and blooming shrubs. As you can see from the chart on the right, bloom period varies greatly among species of plants and even among varieties within species. So planting just one or two types of plant, of flower, let's say, in your yard can be great and look really attractive, but it might leave many species of bees without food for much of the year. So by planting a variety of native shrubs and flowers that will continually bloom all season long, especially those that may produce edible fruits, let's say your blueberries, your raspberries, you'll be supporting many more species, including your own. Also, a special note for anyone interested in wildflowers, do give them time to establish. I haven't experienced it myself, but I have heard many folks just don't realize that wildflowers may not bloom until their second or third year. And a meadow won't be fully established until its third or fourth. So folks will often mow or remove what they think are just weeds or some random plants. They think their seeds didn't actually take root in their yard, when actually what they're doing is removing the wildflower in its first or second year. So do try to be patient. I've included a link here to a great wildflower meadow fact sheet from University of New Hampshire, which may be a useful resource for anyone interested in getting a meadow going. And I'll include that link after the talk as well. Also, to that same end, here's just a quick list of 8 of the most supportive native flower varieties available, including crimson clover, lupin, black-eyed Susans, sunflowers. Most of these can be purchased through local providers, or even, if you're fortunate enough, gathered locally to seed your yard. Hand in hand with establishing native flora, I would argue for a diligent effort to identify and remove invasive plants. I've put just a few of the worst offenders on the screen: multiflora rose, Japanese barberry, and oriental bittersweet. These were initially established in North America as ornamentals, but they're terribly hardy and very competitive and are kind of overrunning a lot of ecosystems. So all of these plants as well can be managed with manual methods, meaning you don't necessarily need to apply chemicals, just be diligent with tools. And you'll be doing everyone and everything a service by taking them out of your yard. So guides to these plants, as well as many other invasives, can be found in the included link on this slide. Again, I can provide this after the talk as well. And when it comes to parasites and pathogens in our yards affecting our bees, it can be kind of hard to know exactly what to do. One angle I'd like to softly offer here is to rethink the hive in general. Honeybees are absolutely awesome, but they are also, unfortunately, major vectors of disease for native bees. If you already do have hives, that is great. Do keep that up and try to focus on the other fronts that I've mentioned. If you don't, but you're considering getting involved in native bee support one way or another, or you'd like bees to sort of attend your yard, I want to offer considering instead establishing other substrates to allow native bees to take up residence in your yard, including bee hotels, which I'm sure many of you have heard about or maybe already have. That's great. These are readily assembled by boring 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch holes of 4 to 6 inches in depth into wooden blocks, or you can even assemble bamboo canes, or like I mentioned before, the raspberry or blackberry canes together, some woody substrate in a covered, sunny location. You don't want them too shaded because the warmth from the sun really does help the bees' biology, essentially. But you also don't want them getting soaked. So you see these all have little roofs and things that will keep rain off of the main nest itself. So yeah, there are many designs online to make your own, or if you want, reach out. I'd be happy to make one for you. It's a great project, though, if you're trying to get outside, or if you're lucky enough to be staying with family right now. Could be a fun project at home. You can also try other DIY habitat establishment, such as creating a burrow for bumblebees to occupy. All you need for this is a bit of garden hose and an upturned flower pot. There's more details on how to pull these together in the included link. There's also the option of adding quick draining sandy loam to parts of your yard, which will encourage ground nesting species to take up residence. So it really is as simple as grabbing a bag of dirt and pouring it onto the ground. And lastly, if you want to help but don't want to turn your entire yard into a bee sanctuary, remember to mind the margins. Yard margins, particularly those alongside a forest, are a hotspot for many native bees. So I would offer that you can consider treating the first 2 to 5 feet out from the edge of your yard as a pollinator-only zone. you can channel a ton of support by focusing right here, and you don't have to turn your entire backyard into sort of a scruffy bee war zone. And of course, if you want to learn more or get involved in a community of other native bee-minded folks, do check out each of these organizations: Xerces Society, Pollinator Partnership, and the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign. Each has a ton of additional resources and info, and can be a huge help in your efforts to make a meaningful and positive impact on our native bees. And yeah, thank you very much, and I'll happily take questions.
Thanks, Wyatt. I was keeping track of questions, and naturally, if people have questions have just occurred to people, then feel free to jump in. We had a question at the beginning about leafcutter bees and whether they pollinate crop species such as alfalfa. One of our listeners did some research on Montana leafcutter bees pollinating alfalfa and was curious if that would be similar to the leafcutter bees you were talking about.
I believe so. If I'm thinking of the right bee, is that just the alfalfa bee?
Was it whose question was that? I can look back up.
That was
I believe
Barbara.
I believe it is
Yeah,
a leaf cutting bee, though, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh,
Yep.
okay. That was Barbara Bowles. Yeah, in the late 70s, I worked for the Montana State University Extension Service, and these were alfalfa leafcutter bees that were actually being actively cultivated
Right.
by the alfalfa farmers who were raising the alfalfa for seed. And so obviously they weren't cutting it until it would flower and then go to seed. And they would put these big trailers out in the field with rows and rows and rows of wooden blocks in some way, shape, or form with deep holes in them, like you showed in the alfalfa cutter bees. And then they would not only harvest the seed when the alfalfa went to seed, but they would also harvest the bees when the cells got full. So my question is this the same alfalfa leafcutter bee, or is it a different kind of cultivar species? Thank you.
Oh, I see. Well, leafcutter bees in general, there are many kinds, and they include the alfalfa leafcutter bee. Hopefully I'm addressing the question here. So the alfalfa bee is essentially just one of many different kinds of leafcutter. I'm not entirely sure if we get them all the way up in New England, but we do have a slew of leafcutter bees in this area that follow a similar biology to what you would expect of an alfalfa bee. So living in these wooden tunnels, and if you were to have substrate for them to occupy in your own yard, you might want to use similar practices of emptying those out every so often. I see. I don't know if that gets to your question or not, though, necessarily.
No, that's perfect. I remember them as being like really super friendly bees, and they would fly up against you, and I'd be in the trailers with like thousands of bees all around.
Oh, that's
me.
awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
That's so cool. Yeah, leafcutter bees in general are very sweet, and many of our native species are, because they're solitary, their main strategy, if you happen upon them, is to just fly away from you. They don't have a hive that they're trying, like a big old hive full of brood that they need to defend. I mean, that's really what it comes down to when you're getting stung by wasps or bees, is you probably just got too close to the hive, and their directive as a worker at that point is to defend at all costs. So it's just protecting the family kind of situation.
So the next question was from Stuart. He was asking, he said that he has about 4 acres of berries, and if he's interested, so that's a little too much to just trim back.
Wow.
But is there a way to manage that, like a larger patch of brambles that would to help the bees?
Wow, I wish I could have gone to your property earlier on in my degree. That is awesome. 4 acres.
You can come anytime you want. I love to show off my I live in Williamsburg, but
oh, sure.
I try to mow as little as my wife will let me get away with. So right now she's got me mowing a little bit out of our 4 acres. And then we were more forested, but I cut it down so I could do clean energy solar.
Oh, good for you. That's awesome.
But for this places that I don't mow that get a lot of canes, I guess I wasn't aware that a lot of the bees are using these as homes and things. So I would like you to explain to me a little bit more about when I should cut them, because what I've been doing in the past is I just leave them up, and then, and sometimes I cut them down now.
Sure.
When I'm going to get the new growth.
Sure. Great. So you have 2 or probably many options, but 2 that come right to mind. If you don't want to cut the whole cane down, once it starts to die back and they sort of dry out, they get that nice dry brown, you can go along and just trim the ends off. The bees mostly just need an exposed pith surface. So if you go for a walk with some shears and you just go clipping along, that'll be enough for them to come and occupy. If you do want to trim them back and you do cut the wooden canes down and away, you can try just flipping them upside down. You can cut them to just maybe a foot length, maybe 1.5 feet, and just stick those down into the dirt around your yard, maybe even just on the margins of your yard. It doesn't need to be out in the open or anything, and they will come and occupy.
Okay, so Wyatt, I call myself a pollinator farmer. I mean, that's why I don't mow. It's for the birds and the bees.
That's awesome.
So what's the best method? I mean, what's the preferred method for handling this? I don't want to do anything labor intensive.
Sure.
I got too much else to do.
No, of course.
I want to help the bees as much as possible.
Well, I would say the simplest answers, I mean, given your property and that you have so many canes, I would just, whenever you feel that you want to go out there and do some work on them, just trim a few ends off, and you're already going to be providing some substrate for the next generation of small carpenter bees, as well as other stem nesting bees that aren't necessarily carpenter bees. There's Hoplitis is another genus, and I believe those are leafcutter bees themselves. They also will make burrows down into soft pith. So you'll be supporting many species that way. And then otherwise, just don't mow so much. Mow every 2 weeks or every 3.
I don't. So what season would you cut these ends off? And how much, let's say it was 2-3 foot long. What's the best, should I leave a foot? Should I leave 2 foot?
Sure. So the best time of year would be probably late fall, say your mid to late October. Once it gets a little chilly out, like not so cold that we're shivering, but cold enough that like plants have pretty much retired for the season, the bees have too. And this way you won't necessarily be catching them a little off guard. And the stems will be ready for this time next year when they're all out and about trying to find a new home. As far as how much to cut off the stem, it's kind of up to you. I would say I wouldn't cut it any shorter than 4 inches. I mean, you can really get them down to the ground if you really want to, but 7 or 8 inches or more is fine, and really any length. And in fact, if you had the desire to do so, you could cut back maybe just the very end of like a 3-foot cane, such that you want to cut enough off that there's about 4 or 5 millimeters of pith exposed. Too little, they won't be able to occupy. Their burrow is only about 2 millimeters wide, which is kind of a hard size to conceptualize just on site, but you'll get a feel for it in the field. Maybe about 1 centimeter wide is how much.
I was gonna a centimeter. That's right, about 1/4 of an inch. Then
about 1/4 of an inch. A little more, a little less won't hurt.
You're talking the wall. You're not talking
the interior of the wall. So there's the harder woody, the shell around it, and then that middle softer part. You want to give them about 1 centimeter, maybe 1.5 centimeters right in there, and that'll be the sweet spot for them to come and occupy. And
inside
again,
the pith is the outside.
Pardon?
Pith, well, you mentioned pith.
Right.
That's the outside, the actual wall of the plant.
As I understand it, pith would be the middle, and then the woody shell on the outside would be like the bark or the
so pith is the donut hole.
Pith is, the donut hole. Yeah, exactly. The cream filling, if you will, of the stem.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
No problem. And thank you. That's awesome. Glad your yard is so
Sure.
rich for the bees. That's really awesome.
So the next questions were related. So the next question actually was asking about the season, and it seemed like you were mentioning fall is when they're looking for homes. Like that's when you want to put out new areas. And then the other question is, if you do have a bee hotel, does it need to be replaced every year?
Good question. So fall would be when they're not necessarily looking for homes anymore. Pretty much everyone's done with their reproductive cycle, but there are bees that are now overwintering. They're going into diapause, which is essentially kind of like hibernation, but it's also a critical stage in their development. So some species will pupate. They'll get like ready to hatch out into adults or become fully adult. They stay in that stage all the way through the wintertime, and then when it starts to heat up, they hatch out, and the first thing you want to do is forage and set up a nest, set up a burrow of some kind, so that they can start this process over again. So, in my opinion, setting up a nest or some substrate for a bee to occupy, the best time is sort of late fall. That way, if you're setting up something brand spanking new that you maybe got from a store or you just built, it'll have time to kind of weather over the wintertime, kind of lose that new car smell. And it'll be there ready to go when these bees are out and about right now next year. I'm sorry, there was a second part of that question too, Tessa.
Whether you need to replace or like clean out your
Right.
bee hotel.
So you could. Bee hotels will be occupied by bees as well as by wasps. And these aren't necessarily the wasps that are like gonna sting you. These aren't like gonna form huge hives or anything. These are your potter wasps, things that'll be collecting like spiders and other things to feed their brood. These wasps do also pollinate though. Many wasps do pollinate. So if anyone's wondering about that, they're also helping out. It's not a bad thing to support the wasps too. I think wasps get a really bad reputation as just kind of nasty, almost like predators that are just out to like sting everyone and anything they can get their hands on. But they're, much like the bees, just trying to protect their home when that happens, or they got trapped in your shirt and they're freaking out. But yes, bee hotels, check them, over the course of the year. If you are going to clean it out, I would say you could probably let them go for 2 or 3, even 4 years before you really need to clean them out, because some species will clear out the burrow for themselves. They'll reuse old burrows. I mean, it's really it's a precious resource, a nice burrow like that normally. So species are adapted to just kind of make it work for themselves. But I mean, it might start to look a little gross, or you may just want to feel like clean slate, let's do this. So every 3-4 years, just plan on cleaning the whole thing out. Wait until maybe mid-May, because I think by that point, a lot of species will have at least dispersed from that block, that hotel. What you don't want to do is wait until the very end of the summertime, because then likely it'll be full of brood, and you'll just be burrowing out a ton of established nests. So, but again, it's up to you. I think even if you were to do that, you're not going to be hitting these populations so hard that it's like, oh no, I was the one who caused the downfall. Like, one bee hotel isn't going to break the backs of these populations.
Christian, that was your question. Is that a full answer? Are you still on the line?
Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for asking.
So getting down to the end of the webinar questions. So the next one was from Susan. I want to study bees with my teenage granddaughter. How can we trap bees without harming them so we can observe them?
Oh, that's very sweet. Let's see. Trapping bees. A lot of the traps I know, unfortunately, are a little bit harmful. It may be, are you talking like you'd like to not necessarily handle it too tightly, but just sort of be able to observe them up close and see what they're up to?
Yes, to get a really good look at them.
Right. It can be a little bit tricky. Unfortunately, one of the major sampling methods we use to do biodiversity assays are, essentially destructive sampling, where we'll have pan traps, soapy water that we put out for one day, and then you see what you get of each species.
Who's ossiflori? Oh, sorry.
No worries. But I would say, methods of catching. You could try sweep netting. You get like basically a butterfly net, and you run that over the top of some flowers. You will almost, if you have a really rich amount of flower that you run that across, there's a good chance you'll actually trap a few native bees in there, because they're so small. They don't actually look very much like bees, and you'll probably miss them underneath the petals and things. They'll be in the net, and then you can transfer them from that net to a jar or something, and then you can look at them inside the jar. The nice thing about it is you can feel relatively confident that they won't sting you. It's a little awkward at first to try to get them like trapped into the jar, but that's one way of doing it. And you can also be sure you're not sweeping up honeybees and bumblebees and other things that maybe will sting if you're not careful. Again, most bees are going to try to just get away, but if you can like target one, get that in the jar, then you can look at it up close for some time. Another option would be just if you have a lot of flowering plants, to try to just hang out beside them for a while and see who shows up. Again, I guess that in that case, you're kind of limited to the pleasure of the bee. They will sit there and then be gone the second you've sort of spotted it. But I don't know. I guess sweep netting would be my suggestion at this point, if you can stand it.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
No problem.
The next question from Pat, which you kind of touched upon, that you mentioned that wasps also are pollinators. The question was hornets. Do they also pollinate?
Hornets, wasps, sort of half dozen of one, six of the other. I don't remember if there's actually even a specific distinction between hornet and wasp, other than just one term being one thing, one the other. So hornets and wasps will pollinate. They just have a much more omnivorous diet, and they like a lot more protein from meat, basically, in their food. So they'll be the ones collecting, beetles, grubs, whatever they can get, bring back to the nest effectively to feed their young. But they do also collect pollen and nectar. These are important resources for all of our many of our insects out there, and they will pollinate as they do this. Interestingly enough, flies are a huge pollinator that we never really talk about that much when we think about pollinators in our backyard. Flies, of all things, are massive pollinators. They do so much work. Beetles too. It's crazy.
Awesome. So next question is, do you have a recommended native pollinator seed mix for Eastern Mass? And this could be something that if you want to talk about it after the webinar, I could link it to the recording, and I could put it in the notes of the recording when we post.
Sure. Yeah. I think I could maybe talk to you some more, Tessa, about this after the recording. That wildflower guide that I mentioned briefly from University of New Hampshire is pretty solid. Essentially, there are so many different seed mixes out there. It can be a little bit daunting to feel like, well, I want to get like the best one that's going to support the most pollinators. I think the more important thing is to just not get one that has non-native or even invasive floral, bodies. And there are a number of great websites that you can go to that tell you what kinds of plants are at least native to our area. And a lot of local garden shops too will have suggestions in that regard. But there's such a diversity even within native flora that it can be tricky to know exactly what's like the best. But yeah, again, the University of New Hampshire floral resource guide is awesome. And Tessa, I can send you maybe 2 or 3 links to these other sites that you can send around if folks are interested. Just off the top of my head, I'm not sure what to recommend other than that kind of broad.
Yeah,
addressing.
that's good. So everyone will talk, Wyatt and I will talk about it after the webinar, and we'll put some resources along with the recorded webinar that we're going to post. So I'll make sure that goes out. The next question is about a landowner who has a 10x4 ideal meadow space, but it's right by a road, and is wondering if that will deter the traffic by foot or by automobile if that deters the bees?
I'd say you're probably fine. That's awesome that you have that space. I would go ahead and seed it and see what happens. It could be, again, 2-3 years, even 4, before you really start to see those flowers going off. But what a fun place to have it too. I think you're kind of doing everyone a service by putting it right by the road, because now drivers are going to enjoy the flowers, passers-by, and the bees. As long as they're not being basically flicked off the plants, they don't really care who's there. So I think that's awesome. I'd say go for it.
Lincoln, do you want to ask your question? Lincoln,
Hi, can you hear
Fish?
me? All right.
Oh yeah,
Thanks.
can you hear you
I
now?
say some of my most profound things when I'm muted, so I just had to unmute myself. My question was, are the bees, native bees, and pollinators dependent on open, sunny land like grassland and brushland, as opposed to a closed canopy forest where the sun really doesn't get down to the forest floor?
Sure.
Is it just a matter of abundance? Do you find a whole lot more in the sunny spaces, or will you get almost no native bees out in the woods?
Great question, Lincoln. So we do get some native bees in the woods, but they are primarily our bumblebees. They're just hardy enough, and for whatever reason, they really prefer that kind of landscape, and they can make it work for themselves. I think their foraging distance is further, and they're much more likely to find the kind of burrows they need in that kind of environment. So, when you're going through a walk through the woods, most often you'll see, oh, there goes a bumblebee zooming past. I've actually just gone on a number of hikes over the past couple of weeks and seen, like on Mount Tom, for instance, tons of bumblebee queens just foraging around not foraging really, but looking for a great place to set up their burrows. What you do get are many, many species setting up their nests on forest margins or field margins. So these are less trafficked areas that go through a sort of daylight, a sun shade cycle. So there'll be a cooler part of the day and a hotter part of the day. These are many of the stem nesting species. They like these margins for that reason. But I would say most native bee species are going to be near to, if not in, an open meadow or field, something like this, where they actually have the resources they need to forage on. But you do find them in the woods too. Short answer.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
That was the last chat question. Does anyone have anything that's come to mind since then? Well, other people's questions have been answered.
I do.
Yes. Hi, Elizabeth. Go for it.
So I've heard Doug Ptolemy speak, and I've read his books, and he speaks of saving the stems, hollow stems of plants, and not doing any cleanup in the fall. And so now I'm really confused about what I can do. So I manage a small triangular park in the middle of Springfield, and
cool.
I have a pollinator garden there. So I've got a lot of stuff planted. I don't rake any leaves in the fall.
Sure.
But then spring came, and now I've got all these tall stems of wildflowers from last year, and they're now kind of falling over.
Yeah, sure.
And I did see a lecture in which I saw some stems that were cut, and they were gathered together like corn stalks and leaning against a house. So I cut some things down and I tied them to the fence. I did that in late March when we had a kind of a sunny day, and so I was able to rake leaves. But I just feel like I'm making this stuff up. I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't know when I should do it.
Sure. Great. I hear you. That is, it can feel really daunting, right? It's like, well, I can't let my property become just like completely overgrown with, or, littered with all this, dead growth from previous years. But I also don't want to, purge everything. I want to be providing substrate if I can. I think your choice to trim away some stems and tie them up against a fence is a really good one. I would make sure that the top of the stem is opened, exposing the interior, and that the bottom is definitely against the ground. This is one kind of tricky thing. This applies to the raspberry canes too. If you trim both sides or like both ends, so there's sort of two entrances, parasites and parasitoids can get up through the other side sometimes, which is unfortunate. So if they're right against the ground, that blocks them. But I would say otherwise, don't be afraid to rake up leaves. Don't be afraid to throw away some bush if it's getting kind of like unseemly or unsightly, and try staking up a few trimmings of previous year's growth and just see what comes of it. I mean, sometimes some of these stems just won't be occupied. It just won't happen. But I think if so I would say, don't be afraid to basically gather things aside. I saw, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Sam Droege. He's at the university. He's at USGA or USDA. What am I saying? Sorry. And he posted a suggestion that people can use sort of trimmings from like raspberry canes or other wildflowers and other plants to make basically like bush partition walls. So it kind of like pulls all those things together into something that you can use as like a way of actually keeping people from trampling your wildflowers for the following year, or from, these other spaces in your yard. I don't know. It's just another way to like sort of use these things in a constructive way, but that may even be more of a project that you're looking for necessarily. It already sounds like a lot to manage the plot of land there. So I would just say, leave some things up along the fence. I think it's a really good call to stack them in that way, pulls them out of the way, and bees will find them if they're looking for a place to live. And the rest of it, don't be afraid to compost it, mulch it, whatever you got to do. The fact that you're growing floral resource in the first place is already a great service.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, hopefully that helps. I'm not sure.
So there's one more question in the chat box from Kyle. Is honeybee pathogen spillover a problem for all bees or mainly just bumblebees?
Great question, Kyle. The short answer is research is ongoing. From what we do know, it is pretty generalized. Essentially, if they can transmit, they will. And it's not so much that they're the only transmitters. It's just there are so very many of them relative to other species. Basically, if you have a hive in an area, the colony count will be so high, and it's just sort of like the tragedy of living in a really densely packed society. If one honeybee catches some sort of illness, they will tend to spread it to a lot of their colony mates, and then those will all go and spread it across flowers. So it's just sort of like a numbers game. Other bees are obviously spreading pathogens to each other as well. There's just they're less dense in number, basically. But it's a tricky one. That one's the slipperiest of the lot in my mind, as far as how we can best address it. And it's not going to go away. You know what I mean? Like, we can just do what we can to try to prevent it or reduce it. But otherwise, do what you can if you're wanting to get engaged. But the pathogen thing is a tricky one.
Are you still there, Wyatt? You just froze.
Oh, I'm back now, I think.
You're back. Awesome.
Okay, cool.
So that was any more questions outstanding? Or are we, So I did, in case you didn't see it in the chat box, just a reminder that this recording will be posted on Hilltown Land Trust website. I'll send out an email to all those people who, I think most of you signed when you registered, had an email. So anyone who I have an email of will be getting an email with the link once it's live, along with some info from Wyatt about seed mixes. Wyatt also kindly said that he could have put his email out there.
Please do reach out.
413@gmail.com if you have follow-up questions. And then I have, Wyatt, if you don't mind, I might share one more slide about upcoming webinars.
Please, by all means. Thank you, guys.
Share screen. But thank you very much, Wyatt.
Oh, my pleasure.
Let's see. Let's pull it up. So for those of you who are still on, you can, if your videos, which is the faces of everyone else, was in the way of the words, you can just click on the top and move it over, which is what I just had to do. But Hilltown Land Trust, we don't have a date quite yet, but we will be having a town bylaw for large scale solar arrays webinar coming up with actually my sister, Zara Dowling, who works for Clean Energy Extension at UMass. The potential date is May 20th, but we're still figuring that out, and we'll make sure that people hear about that one. Also, just FYI, Massachusetts Land Conservation Conference has become a series of webinars, as many conferences have. You can visit at massland.org. And the first one, it's a whole series, but the first one coming up is Forest Carbon, a Natural Solution for Climate Change, on Friday, May 8th. So tomorrow at noon. And that series of webinars is also free. So I will stop sharing, but keep an eye out on the Hilltown Land Trust website for more events to come. And thank you again, Wyatt. This was great.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you all.
Thanks, Wyatt. I'm gonna end the meeting.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.